Please welcome back to the stage your host, Al Boykin.
Did I tell you all how excited I am to have this next panel? Well, if I didn't, let me tell you, I'm excited to have this next panel. This is our industry panel for talking about the different perspectives on innovation of pricing, right? So we have some industry leadership that's coming up along with the Section 809 panel, and they'll talk with you a little bit about what Section 809 is. But I think this is a unique opportunity for the Section 809 folks to hear a little bit more from an industry perspective as well. So the moderator for this particular session is Ms. Kim Rupert. And she, in turn, will introduce our fabulous panel that will, from industry and the Section 809 board members. So Kim is the SAIC's Senior Vice President, Chief Risk Officer. She's responsible for setting policy across functional organizations and to facilitate business operations and ensure compliance with laws and regulations. She was formerly the Vice President for Contracts and Pricing. Kim assumed she's also been a part of the SAIC's Intelligence and Security Technology Division as well. She holds a BA in journalism from the University of Maryland and also an MBA from Johns Hopkins. Kim has been very involved in the National Contract Management Association. She is currently the president of the national president for NCMA, and she's on her last month or so. I'm going to go ahead and invite Kim and all of the panelists to come up. Let's give them a round of applause as we prepare to learn from all of these folks. Thank you all for coming. And Kim, I'm just going to turn it over to you, ma'am.
Well, thank you very much. You're way too kind, and you went into way more detail than you needed to. I appreciate it. Al and I have gone back so many years through NCMA, and so I appreciate this opportunity and am just honored to have such a panel. We have 2 current industry members and 3 809 panel members, as Al said, and I want to introduce them briefly and then get right into the meat of things. So on the far end here, Bret Frankovich. He is the VP of Contracts and Pricing at Northrop Grumman Mission Systems up in Baltimore. I'm going to skip over this other gentleman who I just love dearly, and I'll tell you why in just a minute.
There's that smile again, Kim.
Denyce Carter is our other industry member. She's the Vice President of Contracts and Purchasing for General Atomics, and came here, gave up San Diego weather to come here, so we thank you so much. The other 3 gentlemen, Terry Raney on my left here, Dr. Terry Raney, an 809 commissioner, just recently retired from CACI, and I've served on the board of NCMA with you for a long time. Love working with you and appreciate you being here. Terry has had a distinguished career in the Air Force. He's been on the DAR Council. All 3 of these 809 panel commissioners I'd take all day if I went into great detail about their accomplishments. Mr. Darryl Scott, former Major General Scott, former commander of DCMA, another distinguished Air Force career, a full career as the VP of Contracts at Boeing. These gentlemen will have a lot to offer. And then, the reason I love this man, Charlie Williams. First of all, his qualifications are also renowned. He was a former director of DCMA as well, and a distinguished Air Force career. He has also retired a few years ago and started his own business, which is booming in the consulting world. But I love him dearly because he is the president-elect of NCMA, and I'm thinking 9 days.
Don't miss that. This is just another 9 days.
In 9 days,
got her
I get
smiling.
to hand over the baton to him, and I'm delighted because after a year, it's a pretty. And Terry served. He's the past president this year. I took the baton from him. So Darryl was also on the board. So great panel. I want to dig in first by just maybe hearing from industry real quick on their thoughts on our topic today. Denyce, why don't we start with you?
All right. Well, I'm really encouraged and excited about what's happening in government acquisition today. I think the representatives you have on the 809 panel, some of the initiatives that the DoD, Mr. Shehzad spoke about yesterday, are all moving us in the right direction. I've been for decades in government acquisition, and I think that I've never seen a time like this. So I'm excited about it. I think that the broad initiatives make sense. Sometimes maybe the way that they're being rolled out, we can tweak a bit. So I welcome this conversation with everyone here, and I look forward to hearing the questions from the audience.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited. You guys hear me?
Doesn't sound like
They're going to come running from back behind the stage any second now. See, look, did I tell you?
they got you fixed.
All right.
It's probably
Is this on?
Yeah.
You can hear this? Oh, okay, good. No, just echo some of Denyce's comments. I'm really excited to be here. Appreciate you having me. I agree, it's an exciting time. I think the focus on speeding up the acquisition timeline, it's a noble goal. I think it's an imperative. It's got to happen, and really kind of from a pricing perspective, a lot of focus around data normalization, making sure our data is consistent. Because if we can get to that point where we're all working from the same sheet of music, I think it's gonna help negotiations and it's gonna speed things up. So we're pretty focused on that. In terms of the foundational building blocks of our proposals. But I'm really looking forward to seeing where the conversation goes. And again, thanks for having us.
So, Bret and Denyce, I thought I'd ask you our first question. This is something that has certainly gotten notice in industry out of the NDAA and truly in law now and just waiting to be implemented on July 1st. This new TINA threshold of $2 million. Is it a fear factor for you, or is it Game of Thrones?
I think it's wonderful. I don't really know what fear factor is. All I know is that it's a really good thing. I don't think people realize that with so much of our supply base, so many subcontractors below that $750K threshold, but it's in the noise when you talk about price proposals that exceed $1 billion. And you ask yourself the question, what is the government getting out of having $750K cost of pricing data and certifications? So $2 million is very good. We're excited about it, looking forward to it. I think perhaps we can even go a little further when you look at what's material in a proposal, right?
Bret.
Yeah, I was going to say, can we make it 5? No, I think we were talking backstage about that. I think it's a great thing. It's going to do nothing but help us from an acquisition timeline standpoint. But it's also consistent with, these multi-year acquisitions and, as we're, just take JSF, for example, as we're increasing the quantities on JSF, there are thousands of suppliers that are now coming into the fold that are required to provide cost or pricing data that never had to before. And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge, the sophistication of the supply base. So I think that, from our perspective, I think you look at it from a risk-based approach. I think $2 million is a great step in the right direction.
Coming from industry as well, I agree with you. So, Charlie, you or Terry, perhaps Darryl could maybe talk a little bit about the 809 panel, congressionally appointed, of course, your 3 commissioners, maybe just to be sure that our audience understands what your scope is and where you are in your process, and then I'm going to toss a question at you.
So I'll take a minute and just give a quick top-level overview, and then maybe Terry and Darryl will talk a little bit about some of the things you're going to see coming out of the the next report, which is due for release next week. But for those of you who may not know at this point, in the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act, the Congress required the Secretary of Defense to appoint a commission to look specifically at reforming the defense acquisition system, particularly simplifying the regulations and so forth. And so we stood that panel up with 18 commissioners. 3 of us are on the stage here today. There are 16 currently. I think we've lost 2 since we stood up. But there are 16 current commissioners. We meet pretty much, we meet every month for at least 2 or 3 days as a full group. But each of us is a part of an individual team or several teams. We broke the panel down into about 10 separate teams, and the panel chairman today is Dave Drapkin. He would say 10 plus 1. But at the end of the day, we have several teams working on many pieces of this puzzle to include the acquisition workforce and various other things. So our timeline is due to expire January of 2019. That's the timeline we're working on. We have 6 months after that to sort of wrap up things in the office, sort of work with Congress on ensuring they understand our final report and the pieces that are there. But I'll tell you, we've to this point released our Volume 1 report. That was in January. We're releasing a Volume 2 report here in June, and our final report would be in January of 2019. And if you think, if you like the stuff we did in 1, and you see the stuff that we're going to do in 2, I can guarantee you 3 is going to be a whole lot better. And the way our former panel chair used to put it, fairly bold. So look out for that. I'll leave it to Terry and Darryl to talk about any of the other little specifics they want to highlight.
Well, thanks, Charlie. I'd like to highlight why Congress did this in the first place. Congress was increasingly concerned about cyber threats, about non-state actors, about the resurgence of global great power competition with Russia and China. And what has happened is we have awakened one day and found out that our technological lead has all but evaporated. Our system. Let's put it this way. I don't think the Chinese, the People's Republic of China Revolutionary Army worries much about certified cost and pricing data. What they worry about is speed and lethality. They understand speed to market. In this case, it's the speed to put military useful capabilities in operation ahead of your adversaries, and we have lost that advantage. So the main thrust behind everything we do at 809 is speed. What can we do to speed the acquisition process? And there are 2 things that I'm known for in these conferences. One is I got to say something controversial. So I'll start out by saying I am not sure that a 6-month improvement in the PALT time gained by tailoring TINA submissions matters a hill of beans in the real competition that we're talking about. We have got to be focused on much greater improvements throughout the system, requirements, acquisition, sustainment, everything. And that's the focus of the panel. And the second thing I'm noted for is, Charlie, nice try, but
I'm trying, Darryl. I'm trying to be like Darryl when I grew up, and so it's a sock thing for him.
Okay.
If I remember last conference we had, there were some comments about your socks.
First question is
the first question was actually about the socks you wore. That's true. To build on what Charlie and Darryl said, yes, we're concerned about how do we get the speed of the acquisition process? How do we get solutions to the warfighter or to any government agency with a mission? How do we do that within the system we have? So we're looking at several. I'll talk about 3 things that are coming out of the most recent report that y'all take a look at. One is a concept of a better management internally in terms of how portfolios are managed, and the fact that we need to learn how to do trade-offs within systems. We're recommending several changes relative to funding in terms of carryover of funds, perhaps, color of money, solving some of those issues. One of the gentlemen that's in the audience, Pat Fitzgerald, has worked on that with us. Used to be head of DCAA in terms of recommendations to Congress about let's treat money a little bit more fungibly and allow program managers and contracting officers to react in what I would call a more business-like and a more commercial way to resolve problems and issues that they come across and their challenges, and that will speed things up. That's one of them. The second area is looking at market structures and the fact that we do business, the government does business, and we all spent a long time, each one of us in government as well, in ways that are very process-oriented. And how do we move to a dynamic process of acquiring things, of managing those programs? It's a dynamic market concept that we're developing, but really the bottom line to it is let's recognize that there are lots of products and things out there that we could buy in a faster way, in a more simple way. But a lot of that gets back to, and I don't know how many times we've heard it in conversations and meetings we've had with government and industry folks, is it always gets back to the requirement. So how can the requirement system be brought to a little bit more discipline in terms of what the actual requirement is, and then the industry will tell you can buy it a lot faster once you decide that. So we're looking in those two particular areas of workforce issues. How do we have a workforce that can actually operate in a more dynamic system? And then we spent a lot of time working on commercial items, bring the commercial back to commercial. One of the fortunate things about the panel is Larry Trowell is on the panel, and he chaired the committee who actually wrote FAR Part 12. And so several of the recommendations, both in the first Volume 1 and Volume 2, are really about let's get back to buying commercial items in a commercial way. And we had gotten so far away from that it would be hard to describe how far we'd gotten away from that. So I would say those are three areas, but, Darryl's right. It's about speed. It's about being able to do things faster than our competitors, our adversaries are doing, and how do we make the process more simple? How do we actually have simplified acquisition?
Thank you. So then a question for the 809 panel members. You brought up sort of the environment we're in today really involves heavily BCAA. We aspire to some changes, but current regulations, policies often create an adversarial relationship, or at least a perception of one, between DCAA and contractors. Is the 809 panel addressing that? Are you working on those relationships? Might they, for instance, go back to older days of IPTs to get things done, or what do you think is on the agenda there?
Yeah, Kim. Well, let me just say, by the way, there is going to be another panel this afternoon with the director of DCAA and some folks out of DCMA and industry to talk about some of those things, because that relationship is so critically important. And over the years, it's been a challenge as we've seen the sort of pendulum go back and forth in terms of the amount of scrutiny that the Congress and IG communities require of the oversight agencies on industry. So, yeah, we stood up a very specific team focused on how do we create this integrated set of policy and requirements that bring that system back in balance, and recognizing that ultimately the goal of the compliance organizations is to support the contracting officers' need to work with their industry counterpart to come to a conclusion that's right for both sides. And the compliance system needs to support that, at least from the audit and business system perspective. So we created some very specific policy inside of our first report, the January report, that addresses that. But it's intended to address it from the perspective of how do we reduce the friction in those systems. We have a colleague on our panel that likes to talk a lot about friction because it slows things down. And so to the extent that you can create a system, let's say that's risk-based, that understands materiality and the importance of how you look at that stuff, we think it starts to bring down that tension, that friction between industry and government, and then, of course, allows them to get into those trusting relationships that provide speed. But at the end of the day, these things have to work together. All too often what happens, and I think you'll see that the Congress has reacted to a lot of this in the last few NDAAs, and at least from my perspective, unfortunately, they pick up pieces that need to be fixed. But if you don't put that in an integrated set of things, you lose the ultimate effect, and you get yourself right back to the problem you have. So we're working very hard to address it, and there's more to come. Pat Fitzgerald's sitting out there, and we're working hard on some other pieces of this that'll come out in our last report in January.
Well, and I also look forward to this afternoon's panel. I know you're really going to dig in on all those issues, so I'll try not to go too far down the DCAA lane this morning. A question I got in advance, and by the way, if you're all sitting out there thinking of your own questions, I'd love to hear them. If you write them up, Al Boykin is over there pulling some things together. So I do want to hear your questions and for the panel and industry members, and we'll try to get all those answered. Here's a question, though, I got in advance. Is there a plan within the scope of the 809 panel to standardize proposal data formats such as executable models?
Well, the short answer is no. The longer answer is the focus of the panel is more strategic. And if you're familiar with the military model that says there's strategic, there's operational, and there's tactical, we are trying our best to stay out of the tactical because the tactical implementations really depend on organizational context. The Navy shipbuilding may be different than fixed wing aircraft, for example. It depends on organizational culture, that leaders need the flexibility to implement in ways that best suit their mission. What we are focusing on, and Terry alluded to it, is the idea that perhaps the best way to manage is, rather than managing program by program and transaction by transaction, manage the interaction with industry through a set of portfolios. So we're looking at a set of policies that would both suggest that you can gain speed through the portfolio process because it could radically shorten the requirements process and some of the back-end processes, but also you have the opportunity to standardize how that portfolio executive wants to deal with industry within that portfolio. So no, we're not going down to that kind of level.
But let me make a point about that, though. One of the things we are concentrating on is, and this is the perfect forum because it's about pricing, and that is moving away from being so cost-centric. One of the reasons there seems to be, and having been on both sides of conversations with the DCA from the Air Force side and then in industry, I mean, a lot of the quote-unquote disagreements or the problems of communication, I think has a lot to do with the amount of information that our system demands for everybody to have and to be generated. And if there's ways we can move to more price-centric ways in which things are acquired, think about things in a more commercial and a less and more value-oriented, what's the value you get, and being able to make those judgments, then I think that tension would become less. And so really it's about not taking it up a level, what really matters to the warfighter, what really gets the job done, and let's work from that level in terms of our acquisition processes and not be so, and I know it's a trite phrase, so don't take it wrong, but not be so weed-oriented as we look at the process.
So I have to weigh in here. I always hear this, and I'm pleased to hear this, about minimizing the tension, about IPTs, government and industry working together. And I appreciate Section 809 saying we need to stay strategic. But when it comes to the tactics, when it comes down to the DCA auditor, they want the data. Mm-hmm. It becomes and remains sort of adversarial. So, my question is, how does it filter from 809 to those folks who are on the front end of estimating and supporting a price proposal?
Well, one of the ways we're addressing that is by the Volume 3 report. I think you're going to see a suggestion that takes the vast majority of the transactions that the department does out of the realm of requiring cost and pricing data. A radically simplified system that would say, as Terry said, we're going to rely on markets to establish a fair price, not cost, a fair price. We're going to streamline the amount of documentation that's necessary in order to document that the market has, in fact, set a fair set of prices, and that you'll be able to move through that process much faster. The idea is there are always going to be highly complex transactions for which there is no other way to establish a price other than through cost analysis. If we decide we're going back to the moon, if we're developing new undersea autonomous vehicles for the first time, those kind of things. But what we think is if we can take the vast majority of transactions out of that space, that it frees up resources both on the government side and on the contractor side to concentrate on the times when you actually need to do that. Because so much of what we do now, you don't need to do it. You do it because there's an interpretation that says there's a rule that says do it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
One comment I would just like to make about with all this, we talk about friction and communication, and I agree. I think it would be great if we could, start to tailor our audits a little better. Oftentimes, you got the buying command asking the same set of questions that DCAA may be asking, DCMA may be asking some of those questions. So I think, if we're from a collaborative standpoint, if we are working together, it will get all those questions answered, but perhaps we can tailor some of those audits, and it could possibly reduce timeline.
Yeah. So let me speak to that, Bret, because I think in our first report, in the set of recommendations we offered, some of that comes out in how we talk about audit versus advisory services, and we've got to get the system in balance. Not everything needs to be an audit. And often it's a question of understanding between the contracting officer and the auditor. So we've provided some guidance and suggested regulatory changes that try to get the system to appreciate that not everything needs to be an audit. So I think that's very, very important that we understand that. And so I think you'll see that in at least the first report that we wrote, and I think as we continue, we'll be thinking of that the same way.
All right, I have some great ones for industry as well, but one more on the panel. First of all, I got a great mention of nice socks. I think that's important. Also, admittedly, better than last week.
Wait a minute, which socks? These are mine. Come on.
It's coming from somebody out here.
We need to have a poll.
I'll try to suppress all future opinions on Darryl socks. Is the 809 panel focused on specifically commercial pricing? And are you doing a FAR Part 15 rewrite or
Yes to both of those.
Yes.
Terry, you want to?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look at our two reports, I just remember the first meeting we had in July of 2016, and we talked about two or three areas that we really wanted to concentrate on. One was services, another was commercial items, and particularly, when you put those two together, now you've got a really tough nut to crack in terms of services acquisition. Services are 60% of the total spend. Services mean a lot different, something much different than when I came back in the Air Force and a long time ago. But they, yes, concentrate on commercial, removing all the things that have been added to a commercial item acquisition, and then refinements to the determination process, all those kind of things. We're looking at all those things, and then widening the aperture maybe in terms of how commercial processes would be used to acquire things. So we're definitely looking at those. We see a lot of potential there because you're really taking something that's already there and maybe actually taking it to where it always was intended to go. And I know the other guys have some comments.
So in the context of the FAR, we're recommending, one of the problems with FAR Part 12 today is FAR Part 12 is not the guidance on commercial acquisition. FAR Part 12 has some of the procedures, but then it references FAR Part 15 for others and FAR Part 13 for some and what have you. So one of the things we're trying to do is recommend that we simplify commercial buying by putting all the guidance, including the new guidance we're going to recommend, all that goes in Part 12. Then we come over to Part 13, which is supposed to be simplified. One of the things the contracting officers told us was put the simple back and simplify it. That it's too complex, the rules are difficult to understand, so the easiest way to do this is say, chuck it, let's go FAR Part 15. So we want to make FAR 13 easier to use and more attractive to use, frankly. And then we do have a team that's just recently stood up that's targeted to the Volume 3 report that would rewrite FAR Part 15 and more than just taking chunks of it and putting it someplace else, but trying to make it more user-friendly so people don't give up in exasperation and say, oh, just give me all the data you got and we'll figure it out.
So Kim, just one other thought on this, and it gets back to sort of this dynamic marketplace strategy that we've been having a lot of discussions about. You would read if in Volume 1 we introduced this idea, and when you get into this area of pricing, we're working through some discussions around the thought of market-based pricing, value pricing, those kinds of things, to recognize that those things that are in the marketplace, readily available in the marketplace, how do we sort of switch our mindset, this culture that we've lived in, this price-based culture, cost-based culture for so long, and start recognizing that the market drives prices in and of itself, and I don't need to do anything other than rely on that market price. So this idea, this concept, how we build that into our final report, how we think about that, is a lot of work we're doing because we think if we can get there, it just creates a great sense of relief on the system as a whole.
And by the way, we're still having a conversation about commercial versus readily available, and what do you recommend departing from the commercial language altogether and go to readily available? Our Volume 1 report recommended not departing, but saying, okay, segregate commercial items into commercial products and commercial services. And then you go from there to what Charlie's talking about with the dynamic marketplace. For example, foundries. Foundry services are commercial services. And if you build big, heavy stuff, you probably, in your supply base, do business with foundries.
Absolutely.
That is a commercial service. The fact that it is being used to make a rough part that is then going to be finished and end up in a government system shouldn't change the fact that the foundry service fundamentally is a commercial service. And there are, Denyce, as you mentioned, there are hundreds of other suppliers, small, medium, and large, who provide services that are typical in the commercial marketplace. And why we need them to provide cost data when they don't provide cost data to General Motors, they don't provide cost data to Elon Musk. Why aren't we doing business that way? So that's kind of where we're.
Just one quick comment.
Thank you, Bret.
I think the time is right. I hate to keep harping on data, but there's so much data out there, and how do we leverage all of this good robust market research and use it for good, use it to justify some of these things.
I would add, based on my past experience, and I'm sure Charlie can he's more current than I am on this, but the government has a lot of data. They just don't use it.
I say contractors have a lot of data. We don't use it all the time. It goes both ways.
Yeah, it's how do you create a system that says, I mean, the FAR says this now, don't ask for data. I mean, if you have access to data, don't ask the contractor to submit more data, essentially is what Part 15.4 says. We don't do that very often. And the contractors don't very often say, you know what, you have it all. My current proposal is based on the data that we've already submitted. I'm telling you that that's still the most current data. Let's go from there. So, but how do we make that easier for people to get their heads around?
I'm looking forward to it, I think, as much as these other folks on the stage. So let me ask a question here for industry that kind of shifts gears. And it's a question that I'd be interested in hearing your answers to as well. The FAR requires that those involved in proposal activities are trained. So how do you ensure that your pricing professionals are trained, since this is a moving target?
Well, the gentleman this morning from Lockheed Martin spoke a lot about what that means and training in his environment. And for me, it's meant getting back to basics. You know, there were years when you couldn't find a price cost analyst for love or money. You couldn't find qualified cost estimators. But now that we have them, we need to train them, and we are training them, but not in cost estimating and developing a cost proposal necessarily, but in what is pricing. Because you're talking about contract type, you're talking about product availability, you're talking about the dynamic marketplace. All those things go into the price development. So we have set up some internal training where we bring together contract administrators, cost estimators, finance representatives, and let's work together to determine what's my role and responsibility. I don't, cost a supplier and just toss it over the transom without being part of that conversation. So our next step is to add technical and program managers into that training. It's just as important that everybody's sitting in the same room and having those kind of conversations, because they don't appreciate necessarily each other's perspective. So I'm doing it the old-fashioned way, back to basics. Let's get in a room, let's talk, let's say, what do you do? What do I do? How does that affect the price? And what does that mean when I sit down across the table from my customer? Right. So that's what we're doing.
Denyce, I assume that means sending some people to NCMA training as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I thought so.
And I would just...
Shameless plug.
That was nice. I'd follow that up. It's just, it's oftentimes it's just brute force, getting back to basics. Yeah. I think that, some of our tools get so good, we rely on them almost too much, and we lose a little bit of the analysis. So it's really important that our training utilizes the tools for efficiencies purposes, but we still focus our training on that analysis and that expectation of what your job is. And we make it very clear about your job. I think it's, I was talking with someone the other day about, just negotiations. I think we've got to, email has oftentimes hurt negotiations. Very easy to lob a counteroffer over via email versus taking those 2 or 3 hours sitting down at the table with your pricer with a live cost model and hammering it out. There's no disagreement. You guys are on the same page. There's no misinterpretation, across the particles in cyberspace when I lob an email over. And getting back to some of that skill set a little bit. So just some thoughts there.
Well, as long as we're on skill sets and pricing, folks, I pulled one of these questions out that asks for all the panel's thoughts, and I think it's a great question. It's one that I've been thinking about, speaking of shameless plugs at NCMA. The GCP Summit has been hailed as a great forum for exchanging ideas among pricing professionals. Has there been any plans to establish a pricing professionals organization which can serve many purposes in addition to exchanges of best practices, such as developing trained pricing certifications? And And I know this is something we talked about at NCMA, is having certifications in other areas besides contracting. So I would love to hear from any of you and your thoughts. Is that an area of interest that you have? I know NCMA's ears are opened, and Charlie's looking at the strategy going forward. How can we serve the pricing community better too? Any thoughts?
Just a quick thought, and then I'll let the rest of the panel talk. I think it's a great idea. I think certifications, just in general, they demonstrate that you're current, you're up to practice. You're up on the latest industry trends. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of value in just setting up that structure. But I would welcome that. And
Darryl.
So, I'm on the 809 workforce team, and there are a couple of things that we're going to recommend that are relevant in this space. The first is that as an alternative to DAWIA, Defense Acquisition Workforce Improvement Act certification, that we rely on industry standards of practice and industry certifications. For example, CPCMs from NCMA, the PMI certifications for program managers. NCMA has recently done great work getting their certifications established as an ANSI standard and moving for an ISO standard. So in the pricing space, an ISO standard for pricing administered by a pricing organization outside of the government that both government and industry personnel could rely on, we think is a very, very important step forward. We're also going to make recommendations to make it easier to train jointly, because we think part of the problem here is, we say that it's the same subject matter, but industry goes into a nice posh ballroom in San Diego and trains, and the government goes to, I think they closed down 666 Summer Street in Boston, but that's where I went to my first pricing course, 666 Summer Street, which I think the number was aptly named because it was one of the back gateways to hell.
Oh, dear.
But today we train separately. Mm-hmm. We think it would be better if we trained together, and use of certifying bodies like NCMA, like PMI, like if there were a pricing organization. Now, there is an estimating, a cost estimating organization out there, so you might consider symbiotic relationships between those organizations. But we think that would be a step forward, and it would make the workforce development issue simpler for everybody.
So if I could, Kim, my thoughts on this, and I'm right behind where all this discussion is. The only thing I would point out about what Darryl said and foot stomp it is, I think this idea of sort of joint collaborative training across industry and government helps do a couple of other things too. It helps create those relationships at the early part of careers, because I think this is about getting into the foundational learning space where we all have to learn those foundations of how you do government contracting and so forth. And I think bringing the communities together early on helps that relation set and that trust that we need to break down the cultural barriers that we currently experience. And that takes a little while to do, but starting there, I think, is very important to that shift.
I think you're right. I just have a experience with my own company. Our VP of pricing is out here, Joni Hastings, and she led a team of us, went up to Aberdeen, up from, I guess not far up from here, but farther from where we were. And we went up to Aberdeen and met with the government cost and pricing folks and really got together and talked about a lot of things. It was a great day to share and come together, but we had to create that forum. It didn't already exist, and it really is a lot easier if you have a place to go and talk about various different things. The day was fully enlightening, and we shared oh, so that's what you mean by that. And if there was a common ground, I think, for a lot of even fundamentals from a government perspective and then an industry perspective, that greater understanding, I think, could make just everything easier over time. So I'll toss that baton over to you to pursue at NCMA in the future. Here's another question, and truly I think it's for the whole panel. What are your thoughts on delivering a certificate of current cost and pricing within 5 days of price agreement?
I love this one. So I think contractors understand very well that we have an obligation to provide cost of pricing data before settlement on price. I don't think that practically it's well understood how challenging that can be. We all have many suppliers, subcontractors, and they have suppliers and subcontractors. And the increase to $2 million helps, but it doesn't solve the problem of timeliness and what is being updated while you're in negotiations. I actually think the government already has the authority to say, okay, we're cutting this off right now. 154062C, right, says you can agree on an earlier date. So I think the as of date doesn't need to be the same date as the execution date. Let's agree on what data will be provided on the date that we're considering it, accurate, current, and complete. It really concerns me that this 5 days is also being tied to an estimating system. We have enough challenges as contractors on maintaining the approved status of our various systems than to tie, okay, because you're updating and you can't certify within 5 days if you're interpreting current, accurate, and complete in this really broad way for it to be tied to the estimating systems. But I am pleased to hear from the panelists that, okay, let's talk about what this data is, right? Let's get a common understanding, at least for a particular transaction, what cost or pricing data is important for this deal, and agree upon the limits or define what the limits of that data are.
Any thoughts from you, Bret?
I think Denyce said that perfectly. 5 days is a challenge, especially the higher up you go from a supply chain and a tiering standpoint. So from a prime's perspective, think about sometimes you're collecting cost or pricing data 6 tiers down, and you're losing privity of contract at every stage there. You're losing communication at every stage there. So I think that's something to consider in terms of the complexity of the acquisition, the magnitude of the acquisition. That is a challenge, and I would echo that is a concern tying it to the estimating system.
Bret is he's the first person I've heard in a forum like this that kind of hits at my pet bugaboo on this, which is the challenge of getting accurate and timely pricing information out of the supply chain it really is the issue. When behind this streamlined process, there seems to be an assumption that control of time exists solely at the prime level, mm-hmm. and that the primes could do this if they wanted to. They're just being kind of recalcitrant about it all. Well, you have to realize that whatever deadline the government gives to the prime, time is going to be subtracted out for the subs. Right. And it's not just, it is the communication, absolutely, mm-hmm. Bret. But it's also, so you're giving each one of these layers less time, and that diminution of time potentially comes at the risk of accuracy, which leads to a different kind of sclerosis in the system. Now, in 809, we are not getting involved tactically, but I tell you, we got to rethink how we deal with the supply chain, how we deal with pricing the supply chain. Mm-hmm. I would argue that the government may need to do a little less hands-off, because in some cases the government's got more information about what's going on in the supply chain where there are suppliers who are shared among multiple primes, we're not giving you information that's not what you expected on purpose. We're not trying to pull something over on you. We're doing what you asked us to do. It is complete, current, and accurate to the best of our knowledge. If you have other knowledge, why are we playing gotcha with it?
Right.
So, Darryl, let me pick. So, does that mean you think that industry, and I'll ask the industry colleagues here, would be interested in giving the government more privity down through the supply chain?
I am no longer a representative.
So, Denyce, Bret?
I'm a retired gentleman. But actually, I'm kind of thinking about it in my.
We've had some of this discussion about.
I'm kind of thinking about this in my former DCMA hat and my former Air Force hat. Once upon a time, for example, Air Force Contract Management Division used to do subcontract management, and part of that was deep knowledge about what was going on in the supply base, and using that knowledge to its advantage in pricing. We made a decision in the late 80s, early 90s that nope, primes have privity. We're going to completely rely on the primes, and that made sense in 1990. And the time periods didn't bother anybody in 1990. But in one of the testimonies we got in front of the 809 was from a senior military department official who said, if you're dealing with cyber threats, you're dealing with threats that change on an hourly basis. Having an acquisition system that takes 2 years to award a contract for cybersecurity is just a non-starter. So what would a system look like that was responsive but still gave the government confidence that it was paying a fair price for what probably is not a readily available product or service? I think we need to rethink how we do this and how we go about sharing information.
I want to respond to the privity piece of it. I think there's real value in the data, the information that DCMA, DCA, other government agencies have on these common suppliers. But I have a fear as a prime contractor that you're not so transparent with us when it comes to this is the price we know or the cost that we know that your sub-tier suppliers, if you don't share that with us, then we're sort of in that gotcha situation. And it's happened to me. We tried to have this sort of true integration between some major subs, us as the prime, and us and DCA and our customer. And they were like running literally from room to room, right? Because our sub-tier didn't necessarily want to share all the information with us. So I think we need to get past that. But
and Denyce, when I was an industry representative, we had that same frustration. It's well, Mr. Government, if you know more about what's going on at one of my suppliers than I do, I'm telling you what my supplier is bound to share with me, and I'm telling you what my analysis of what they've shared is. If you have other information, why are we playing this game?
Well, since we're on this topic, I wasn't here yesterday, so I didn't get to hear it, but we got a question on it, so I want to go ahead and ask it. Shay Assad was here and spoke, and this person who wrote this question wants to know, what does the panel think about Shay Assad's June 5th memo, reducing acquisition lead time by eliminating inefficiencies associated with cost or pricing data submission after price agreement? I hear there wasn't much discussion yesterday. I'd love to hear a little bit today.
Well, I think anything that can be done to reduce the time, but you've got to take into account what risks are there. I think Shay actually said in an interview on the radio or something that industry has to be prepared to assume more risk I think that's back to your point, Denyce. If you're going to, if we're going to certify, 5 days, are you really going to have that sweep done and know everything? No, you're not. I mean, who's kidding who here, all right? So somebody has to assume the risk. And Shay was very upfront about that. I think that, the industry assumed more risk. Well, the only way you can do that is have more insight into what your subs are doing, to what your supply chain is. I find it, I was around in CMD in the days when they did away with Air Force CMD. We had some contract management divisions. At that time, maybe 10, 15% of most proposals, major weapon systems, were supply chain issues, were subcontracts. 80, 75% was the prime. Today, it's just the reverse of that. And yet we've done away with the group that provided some of that insight. Now, it was limited, and I did that for a little bit of a while, and you'd go out there, and of course, the contract of the prime was with you everywhere, but at least you got a little bit better idea. And I think you have to go back to something like that, particularly if you go to a more of a commercial aspect in terms of pricing rather than let's count the beans and let's make sure we understand how the cost buildup is. Because don't think that it's a cure-all to go to a more commercial pricing. Let's get away from the cost buildup. Because I tell you what, in many ways, that's even harder to figure out what a fair and reasonable price is when you're doing it at that level. Your data is perhaps different than you're used to. The training is a little bit different. It's a different thought price. It's a different thought price completely. So when you put all that together, I'm not sure what his point is, other than we're going to speed it up. As Darryl says, if you take money away from, or take time away from the prime, then you're going to take even more time away from the subs. And so it's about risk. How much risk is there? And I'm not sure why it should be 5, 10, whatever. Get a certified cost and pricing day. When you get an agreement, the prime takes that responsibility. You move on. We've had many conversations with the 809 panel about thresholds and time, okay? All right, I think they all ought to be higher, okay? The thresholds ought to be higher. It shouldn't be $2 million. It should probably be $15, $20 million for certified cost and pricing data, all right? Particularly in talking the services environment, and you really understand that.
From your
and
mouth.
The same thing with time. So some of that will happen, some of it won't, but at the end of the day, I think that I have a little bit of a problem with the idea about some of what he said there. Just assume more risk.
Denyce,
okay.
you and I talked about this a little bit backstage. Do you want to elaborate a little more on your thoughts?
Well, I think I covered some of it, about the perception of contractors not wanting to provide cost or pricing data or not understanding our obligations, right? And I support speeding up the acquisition process. I just think the way perhaps that it's being rolled out may not have the intended or the desired effect of let's truly have a meeting of the minds on price. Let's let the government be comfortable that they're paying a fair and reasonable price, and let the contractor get its costs covered and make a fair and reasonable profit based on the risk they're assuming, the work they're performing, and delivering stuff as needed, right?
My concern with the memo is a little different, and it's change management. Most of the acquisition reform that I've seen over my career has not paid sufficient attention to change management. Without going into the details about whether I think the policy in the letter is right or wrong, what I worry about is you're asking the acquisition workforce of the Defense Department, 165,000 people, to change their behavior in a dramatic way. And then you're asking contractors, millions of them, to change their behavior in a dramatic way. But you've not rolled out any tools. You've not rolled out a set of objectives or expectations. You haven't told people what right looks like. You just told them, this is what I want you to do. Well, how will I know when I've got it done? You haven't changed the schoolhouses.
Darryl, you are hitting on my great next question, which is, I'm really open to all of you. I know that the 809 panel is strategic and not tactical, as you said, but the question is, what are the strategies to address the mindset and organizational cultural issues? Rewriting the FAR does not change the mindset and the culture. And so how do you go from, law and regulation to implementation and then cultural adaptation any recommendations for the audience on where they can go to try to make those things happen if the 809 panel can't address those kinds of items? How can they help to create change in this way on the implementation side? Bret?
I don't know if I'm answering your question right on, but I would say it's a culture of empowerment and understanding the ranges, the flexibility at the working level. You know, how much empowerment do I have? I think that if we can build in some of that, I don't know, lack of a better word, elasticity for contracting officers, where they and create that culture where they are truly empowered, and that doesn't cut across the board. But there's a lot of new people in the acquisition field. When you're brand new, it's hard to be agile, and so I think it's just something we need to think about in terms of a culture of empowerment through our training.
Okay.
809.
Well, yeah, well,
809 on
yeah,
on
I mean,
recommendations. If you're not recommending to Congress, what can the audience do to?
Well, let me take this. I mean, we've met with lots of different organizations, and a question we tend to ask every time, I'm usually the one asking it because the team that I am on, that's looking at the entirety of the FAR and those things, is and the question we ask is, what exactly is it that you can't do today under the FAR that you need to do? And we've yet to have anybody say, oh yeah, if you change these three things to the FAR, it's nirvana. It's usually, well, it has nothing to do with the FAR. You know, I can do what I need to do under the FAR. It has more to do with the culture of the organization. What are the limits put in? How many reviews I have to go through? And we hear all the stories about, you know, the different approval levels, things that have gone into things like that. And so, to me, it gets back to, we're going to point that out. We're pointing it out in many things we've got. But it's a leadership issue. It's a leadership issue on the part of government leaders to back up their people. You say empowerment. It's also incumbent upon industry to live up to that, so that the risk that the government folks feel they have, they feel like it's not as great. That today, I think many of them feel is much higher than it really is. That's
and
my
maybe we can address this in some sort of a new platform place where government and industry can come together and just talk about this. Maybe we can get the government side to address those very issues you're just talking about,
right?
Culture on the government side and their challenges and how we can resolve them together.
Through organizations, through I think a pricing organization would be great. Anything like that. Of course, one thing we've heard constantly too is the lack of communication between government and industry. That has changed, not as good as it was in the good old days, whatever those were. But that all is part of anything. Nothing much good happens unless there's a mutual trust and understanding where each party's coming from, and that's a big part of the recommendation we're making, particularly when it gets to some of the management issues and workforce.
And we are going to speak to culture in our a little bit in our Volume 2 report, much more dramatically in our Volume 3 report. But Terry's right. It comes down to leadership. I gave an impassioned speech yesterday that bored my colleagues to distraction. But the short version is when the three of us commissioners entered the system, which was all of us about the same time, the system was based on judgment and a presumption of good faith. Right. So what that meant to the contracting officer was if you exercised sound business judgment in good faith, you could expect that your decision was going to get supported. We've moved from that to what I call a criteria-based system. It's people don't care about your judgment. They don't care about good faith is something that we don't talk about enough, and we should. Just like we ought to talk about ethics, we ought to talk about transparency more. But now it's, did you meet some threshold? It's either a threshold that your leadership put in place, or it's a threshold that DCAA uses or DCMA uses, or The wild card is the DODIG comes in and makes up their own rules or interpretation of the rules sometimes. But it's all about criteria. So the idea is, stay within the criteria. We need to go back to a system where we leaders, if we believe we've done our job training and preparing our people, then we should trust them. If we trust them, then we should believe that they're going to make good decisions as long as we give them clear guidance and direction. And then when they make those decisions, we have to be willing to stand up and say, you know what, I'm behind Denyce's decision 100%. And until leaders start doing that, then this thing we call risk-averse culture and all that, I got to tell you, I am tired of hearing people in leadership positions complain about the workforce or complain about a risk-averse culture. Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? If you are a leader, if you're a VP in a company, if you're an SES, if you're a GM15, it's your bloody culture. It is the culture that you made in your organization. So if you want to fix it, go fix it. Go stand up in front of your workforce on Monday and say, here's what we're going to do different.
Yeah, and that's government and industry both. That's not one side. That is
both sides.
Both sides. Absolutely both sides.
As we've sat here and me listening to you guys talking, I've also been thinking, how can we get the conversation to occur besides another forum? And maybe it's a contract management magazine article, some interviews of leaders, asking them questions, and publishing it for thought and comment.
Boy, what a great idea.
Wait, am I going to get in trouble on that? I'm not getting in trouble on that. I don't want to write anything, but all right, let's shift gears a little bit and address another question. How has industry adapted to the government's emphasis on the use of category management?
I don't know that I can answer that well. We don't sell products that necessarily fall nicely into categories and services. We're trying to absorb it to see how it can be used in our supply chain, but I don't Bret.
All right, well, then there's a second part of this, the 809 panel. Not everyone gets off that easy. Does the Section 809 panel envision any changes in the area of category management? Have you addressed that topic?
Not in category management. We're not addressing that. And our charter is for the Defense Department, and the Defense Department is not heavily into category management. That's more GSA and the civilian agencies. But the idea of portfolio management, which GAO has said is a best practice, we're going to go in heavily on portfolio management, kind of a preview of things to come in Volume 2, and then a full-blown architecture in Volume 3.
Yeah, that's, Darryl, I would just say that probably one of the bolder things we're going to attack, to Darryl's point, as we get into Volume 2 and 3, is this idea of portfolio and enterprise portfolios, which to some extent is all about pushing authorities down, which supports what the Congress has already sort of tried to drive into to DOD. But as you think about that, the ability for portfolio leaders, I'll call them, they have the ability to do some radical things with respect to the money that's within their portfolio, transfer and move money around based on the needs of the portfolio. So if you think about the weapon system world in terms of categories, you think about that as a portfolio maybe, but you would empower those portfolio authorities down in the services, not at the OSD level, or even maybe at the service level, to have a lot more authority to manage things in that. So this idea of how you categorize things and give authority to folks who own those categories is a powerful one and can work in that weapon system environment as well.
Before there was category management, academia called it coordinated purchasing. And, we're going to provide the means to do coordinated purchasing through the enterprise portfolios, but we're not directly speaking to category management.
All right. I think one final question. I know we're going to have lunch at noon, but I'm going to ask this one final question from the audience. Has the 809 panel captured thoughts from industry, particularly small business, and also at subcontractor levels?
So I'll start with that one because one of the teams that we first set up, Team 4, it was about barriers to entry. And the first thing that we did in that team was to go out and we went out west, we went up to Boston, we went in sort of the middle part of the country to talk about and hear from industry, and particularly small businesses, and particularly those companies who are not necessarily involved with the Department of Defense today, because we were trying to understand what are those critical barriers. And we've talked about some of those here today. I mean, the insatiable appetite for data, the compliance structures that we require industry to set up. So a lot of that input and that information we receive has helped inform the decisions and recommendations that we're making. So yes, we've listened.
Yeah, we have, and we've gotten a lot of input from, as part of that exercise, from private equity companies and other people that actually control the money that's available to those small firms. And they basically, in many cases, said we generally tell them not to do business with the government, because of all the compliance issues, because of the reporting. Yeah. It's interesting. And when you hear from a private equity firm that basically says we tell our clients not to do business with the government, then you know you have some issues there. So yes, we've heard that. A lot of the recommendations are aimed to maybe can we remove those barriers, because you're not going to get the technology that we know we need going forward without removing those barriers and getting those companies involved.
So the part of the question that says, have we heard input? I'll deal with, we have a website where anybody can submit good ideas, but it closes on June 29th.
Very soon.
So if you have an idea that you would like us to address, it's section809panel.org. No spaces or punctuation between section 809. Section809panel.org. There's a space to make inputs. There will be no extension, so get it in before a week from tomorrow. And we did, by the way, Charlie and I and Dave Drapkin, the chairman, addressed the NDIA, AIA Supplier Management Council last week, because yes, we are communicating directly with the supplier base as well as with the.
That's great. I see Al waiting in the wings, so I'm going to go really quick and ask just one question of each of you, just a couple of words in answer. Your king or queen for the day of all acquisition. What's your favorite reform initiative? What would get it there for you and really create that streamline, that speed that we're looking for? Bret.
I would say anything that helps with material, that helps with the supply base. Anything that can be done, TINA threshold, raising that is a great start. But thinking about the complexities in today's day and age, where so much is bought from prime. The primes are buying so much versus manufacturing like they used to.
Charlie.
So I guess I'll just pick up on this dynamic marketplace idea, because if we can move the Department of Defense from sort of a rule-based, process-oriented business for the stuff that you or I can go out and buy ourselves and transact with the market the way the market transacts with itself, that would be so powerful. Now, there's always going to be that big stuff that you got to treat differently because it's unique. But I think we've sort of told ourselves probably 80 to 90% of what the department does fits in this other world. And we need to operate in that world the way it operates with itself.
Denyce.
Well, the queen for the day, I think that underpins all of this conversation is really centered back on trust. And these kind of conversations help with that. But I also took the message away clearly that industry is a big part of that conversation, in that we have to develop and support our government customers, DCAA, DCMA, so that the information we can provide to them, that the conversations we have across the table are open, transparent, and it's just slowly building up that trust.
Darryl?
If I were king for today, I would invest more in the workforce on both sides. That I think on both sides, when budgets get cut, training is often the first thing to go, and pretty soon you wake up and find out you're just providing the minimal amount of training to keep people barely competent rather than to develop true expertise. So, my pet is let's invest more in the workforce.
Terry?
Yeah, I think it's really about you can do some simple things like raise thresholds, but it's more about empowerment of at lower levels and allow people to go forth and understand what they can do and then go do it and then have the leadership available to back them up.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, please help me thank this esteemed panel. I appreciate it very much. Thanks. Have a great rest of the conference.
Good job.
I want to thank Kim. You handled this panel brilliantly with all of this expertise up here. And thank you all for coming. Thank you all for all of the great information. And oh, by the way, here's a perfect opportunity for you all to you talk about innovation and change. So to get with the Section 809 panel and provide those recommendations is crucial, and this is a perfect time to do it. So see them outside, go to the website. And Darryl, I'm glad to see that you're not so passionate about that risk aversion thing. So it's all good. Thank you all for coming. Let's give them another round of applause here. Absolutely. Thank you, sir.